98 Africans arrived at Annapolis Harbor on September 29, 1767 aboard the Lord Ligonier. 42 had died during the crossing. Among those who lived was a 17-year-old Mandinka warrior who would spend the next 55 years refusing to forget his name. The records from Spotsylvania County, Virginia, show a slave bought that October given the name Toby. But what those records do not show, what plantation books left out on purpose, and what family Bibles refused to admit, was the planned effort to wipe out not just a man's identity, but the living memory of a whole culture. This is the story of how one African turned the cruelty meant to break him into a legacy that would outlive his captors. What you are about to hear has been hidden by 2 centuries of silence, and the truth is far more upsetting than anything you have been told. Before we go on with the story of the man who became known as Toby, make sure you are subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And we would love to know. Leave a comment telling us what state or city you are listening from right now. The details of what happened next come from sources that took nearly 200 years to come out. The Gambia River cut through West Africa like a wound that never healed, carrying British ships deeper into the land than any other waterway on that coast. By 1767, the trading post on James Island had processed tens of thousands of captured Africans, but the need from Virginia tobacco plantations had reached levels never seen before. The wars between local kingdoms created chances for slave raiders, and the British Royal Africa Company paid high prices for young men with warrior training. In the village of Jufure, 2 miles from the British fort, the Kinte clan kept their name as blacksmiths and holy men despite the constant threat of raids. The Mandinka people had lasted for centuries by mastering the art of looking helpful while keeping their traditions in secret. They taught their children to be careful near the river, to never go alone into the forest, and to run at the first sight of the Slatties, African slave traders who worked for European buyers. Amoro Kinte understood these dangers better than most. As a blacksmith, he had seen the iron chains that bound captives for travel. He had heard the stories of villages emptied overnight, of families torn apart and sold to different ships. He taught his oldest son the traditional skills of drum making, not just to save culture, but as useful knowledge. A young man who could make instruments might be kept alive aboard a slave ship to keep spirits up among the captives. The boy's name carried weight in Mandinka tradition. Kunta meant complete or whole, a name given to firstborn sons who were expected to carry on the family's name. At 17, he had finished his manhood training, learned to hunt with a spear, and could say his family's line back 7 generations. The village elders spoke of him as someone who would one day become a respected elder himself. On a morning in early July 1767, Kunta went into the forest near Jufure to gather wood for drum making. The specific type of hard wood he needed grew 3 miles from the village, far enough to be dangerous, but close enough that many young men made the trip often. He carried no weapon. Mandinka warriors did not hunt on sacred gathering grounds, and he moved with the trust of someone who knew these paths since childhood. What Kunta did not know was that British Colonel O'Hare's forces had arrived at James Island 3 days earlier, bringing orders for a large shipment of slaves to fill Virginia's labor shortage. The Lord Ligonier sat anchored off the coast, its captain under pressure to fill the ship's limit of 140 captives before the weather turned. The usual networks of African slave traders had been put to work, paid bonuses for young males between 15 and 25 years old. 4 Slaties had been tracking Kunta since he left the village. They were professionals, men who had perfected the art of ambush over dozens of successful captures. They knew to strike quickly, to overpower their target before any sound could alert nearby villages, and to tie captives so well that fighting back became impossible. The attack happened with scary speed. The first blow came from behind, a wooden club hitting Kunta's shoulder and driving him to his knees. Before he could cry out, hands clamped over his mouth, while others pinned his arms. They moved with practiced teamwork, tying his wrists with rope and wrapping cloth around his head to blindfold and gag him at the same time. Within 90 seconds, Kunta went from free man to goods. The Slaties dragged him 3 miles to a holding area near the river, where 24 other captives sat, chained in a temporary pen. Some were from Jufyor's neighboring villages. Others had been captured weeks earlier and moved from inland regions. All showed the same signs of shock and terror. The sudden change from person to property happened so quickly that the mind struggled to understand it. For 3 days, Kunta stayed in that holding pen while the Slaties collected more captives. The conditions were purposefully cruel. Very little food and water, exposure to the sun during the day and cold at night, and the constant presence of guards who beat anyone who made too much noise. The mental impact was as planned as the physical abuse. These men wanted captives who understood that fighting meant suffering, that doing as told was the only path to survival. When the Lord Ligonier's crew came to collect their cargo, they brought a British ship's doctor named Dr. Thompson. His job was to check each captive for disease, injury, or flaws that might lower their value. The checkup was careful and treated them like animals, checking teeth, feeling muscles, looking at bodies with the same attention a farmer might give to livestock. Of the 32 captives shown, he rejected 7 as not good enough. Kunta passed the check. At 17 years old, he was exactly what Virginia tobacco plantations needed. Young, strong, and trained in physical work from years of blacksmith work. The British paid the Slaties in rum, cloth, and iron bars, standard money for the slave trade. Kunta became property of Captain Thomas Davies, recorded in the ship's list simply as male, approximately 17 years, Mandinka origin. The trip from shore to ship happened in small boats that carried 10 captives at a time. British sailors handled this transfer with practiced skill, knowing that this moment, when captives first saw the huge ship that would carry them across the ocean, often caused desperate escape tries. They kept everyone chained and moved quickly. Kunta's first sight of the Lord Ligonier showed the size of what was happening. This was not a raid on a single village. This was a factory operation that had been improved over decades of practice. The ship was designed specifically for human cargo, with multiple decks changed to hold as many bodies as possible in the smallest space. Other captives were already aboard, their faces visible through the cargo hold's small openings. The British crew herded the new captives below deck, where they met conditions that defied human understanding. The slave deck measured about 5 feet high, forcing everyone to crouch or lie down. The space given for each person was roughly 16 inches wide and 6 feet long. Barely enough room to lie flat. The heat was choking, the air thick with sweat and fear. wooden platforms divided the space into two levels, effectively doubling the number of captives that could be packed into each section. The crew chained captives together in pairs, right ankle to left ankle, making moving alone impossible. Extra chains ran along the walls, attaching to the ankle shackles and stopping anyone from reaching the stairs. The mental impact of these chains went beyond physical jail. They made it clear that individual survival depended on the help of whoever you were chained to. Kunta found himself chained to a man named Fanta, captured from a village 50 miles inland. Neither spoke the other's language perfectly, but they shared enough common Mandinka roots to say basic needs. Fanta had been jailed for 2 weeks and understood the ship's routines. When food came, how to move your body to avoid the worst cramps, which British sailors were most likely to give random beatings. The Lord Ligonier stayed at anchor for another week, while Captain Davies made deals with coastal traders for more captives. During this time, conditions below deck got worse fast. The British gave food once per day, a mix of beans, yams, and sometimes fish served in shared buckets that 10 people shared. Water came twice daily in small amounts that left everyone in a state of constant thirst. The waste buckets quickly overflowed, and the crew's answer was to hose down the deck once every 3 days, treating the captives like farm animals. Disease spread with scary speed in these conditions. Dysentery appeared within days, causing severe loss of water and weakness. A fever swept through one section of the hold, killing 4 men in the first week. The ship's doctor looked at the sick, but made no attempt to treat them. His job was to guess whether they might get better enough to be sold, not to give actual medical care. On July 5th, 1767, the Lord Ligonier left Africa with 140 captives chained below deck. Captain Davies wrote in his log that he was happy with the cargo's quality and expected a profitable trip. What he did not record was the planned cruelty needed to keep control over that many desperate people trapped in nightmare conditions. The Middle Passage, the trip across the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas, usually took between 6 and 12 weeks, depending on weather conditions. The Lord Ligonier's path would carry them past the Cape Verde Islands, then southwest across the ocean's widest point, before catching the trade winds toward the Caribbean and up the North American coast to Annapolis. For the captives, the trip became an endless cycle of suffering marked by short moments on deck. British rules needed bringing slaves topside once per day for exercise. 30 minutes of forced movement while still chained, supposedly to stop muscle loss, but really to lower the death rate enough to protect profits. These moments gave the first chance for captives to talk across language barriers and see the size of their shared situation. Kunta's training as a warrior and his cultural teaching proved useless in this setting. Everything he had learned about bravery, honor, and fighting back meant nothing when you were chained in darkness with no weapon and no knowledge of where the ship was taking you. The mental torture was careful, being alone from everyone who shared your language, not knowing your destination, and the physical weakness from very little food and water that made clear thinking nearly impossible. But Kunta noticed patterns in the British crew's behavior. The sailors who brought food were less watchful during rough weather. The deck exercise happened at the same time each day unless storms stopped it. The ship's doctor rarely went into the holds between formal checks. These observations meant nothing in terms of immediate escape, but they showed that the ship's work followed routines that could potentially be used. Other captives made similar observations. A man named Caddy, who had been a trader before his capture, understood some English from dealing with British merchants. He listened carefully to talks among the crew and reported what he learned to those around him. The ship was bound for Naples, which some captives recognized as the Mandinka way of saying Annapolis. They would be sold at auction to work on tobacco plantations. The British expected most of them to die within 10 years from cruel work conditions. This news created an impossible choice. Several captives discussed trying a rebellion once enough of them reached the deck at the same time, but the chains made coordinated action nearly impossible, and the British crew was armed with guns and swords. Any rebellion that failed would result in immediate killing of everyone involved. The risk math was brutal. Try escape and almost certainly die, or accept slavery with a small chance of eventual freedom. Kunta listened to these debates but did not join in. His father had taught him that warriors choose their battles based on real assessment of winning chances, not on pride or desperation. Everything about their current situation made rebellion suicide. But he filed away every detail about the ship's routines, every weakness in the British crew's procedures, every piece of information that might prove useful later. 3 weeks into the trip, a fever swept through the hold with devastating speed. The same conditions that made the space hellish, extreme heat, lack of fresh air, dirty water, poor sanitation, created perfect breeding grounds for sickness. Men who had survived capture and the journey to the ship died chained to their partners. Their bodies left in place for hours or sometimes days until the crew noticed and removed them. The ship's doctor, Dr. Thompson, recorded each death in his log with cold distance. By his math, a 15% death rate was acceptable on slaving voyages. 30% required investigation. If deaths went over 40%, the captain would face trouble from the Royal Africa Company for bad management. The dead were not people who had lost their lives. They were inventory that affected profit margins. Kunta's partner Fanta got the fever during the 4th week. The early signs were clear: shaking chills despite the heavy heat, severe headache, growing confusion. Fanta remained clear enough to recognize what was happening to him. And in a moment of heartbreaking clarity, he apologized to Kunta for what would come next. Within 2 days, Fanta died, and Kunta spent 18 hours chained to a dead body before the British crew noticed and removed it. The crew did not give Kunta a new partner. Instead, they shortened his ankle chain and attached it directly to the wall, giving him even less movement than before. This separation was not on purpose. The crew simply had not captured enough slaves to replace all the dead, but it made Kunta's mental torture worse. For weeks afterward, he lived in a state of near-total sensory loss, surrounded by suffering people, but unable to talk meaningfully with anyone. Just when we thought we had understood the full horror of the Middle Passage, the conditions aboard the Lord Ligonier grew even worse. The weather turned bad as the ship approached the Atlantic center. And what happened next would test every survivor's will to live. If you are finding this story as upsetting as we are, hit that like button to support our content. Share this video with someone who should hear this history and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Let's continue with the nightmare that was still unfolding. The storm struck during the 7th week at sea. Atlantic storms in late summer tested even experienced ships like the Lord Ligonier. Captain Davies had crossed this route 24 times, but every trip brought weather that could turn deadly within hours. The first signs came at dawn: a sudden wind shift, clouds building on the western horizon, a scary drop in air pressure that made the air feel thick and heavy. Davies ordered the crew to secure all cargo and prepare for rough seas. For the captives chained below deck, this preparation meant absolutely nothing changed. They remained shackled in the same positions. But now the ship began to pitch and roll with increasing violence. Men who had been lying down were suddenly thrown against their chains as the vessel lurched sideways. The wooden platforms above their heads creaked and groaned, threatening to collapse under the shifting weight. The worst part was the water. Atlantic storms drive waves over the deck, and on slave ships, that water had nowhere to go except down into the holds through the small air grates. Within hours, 6 inches of seawater washed back and forth across the slave deck, mixing with waste from the overflowing buckets and creating a toxic soup that captives could not escape. The shackles kept everyone pinned in place while dirty water washed over them again and again. Kunta had experienced tropical storms in Africa, but nothing prepared him for the helplessness of being chained during a sea disaster. The ship would rise on a wave, pause at the top, then plunge downward with enough force to lift chained bodies briefly off the wooden platforms before slamming them back down. The sounds were terrifying. Wood groaning under stress, crew members shouting orders overhead and all around him. The cries of men sure the ship was sinking, and they would drown while shackled in the darkness. The storm lasted 4 days. During that time, the British crew made no attempt to bring food or water below deck. Keeping their own safety took priority over saving their cargo. The captives lived in a nightmare state of thirst, hunger, violent motion, and the constant fear that the next wave would be the one that broke the ship apart. Several men lost their minds during those 4 days, screaming continuously until their voices gave out, then continuing to scream silently with mouths open and eyes showing nothing but terror. When the weather finally cleared, Dr. Thompson went down into the holds to check the damage. 18 more captives had died, some from injuries gotten during the violent motion, others from drinking the dirty water out of desperate thirst, and a few from what appeared to be purely mental collapse. The doctor ordered the bodies removed and thrown overboard, then had the crew hose down the slave deck without bothering to move the survivors first. The Lord Ligonier's journey showed the exact math of the transatlantic slave trade. Captain Davies had left Africa with 140 captives. The storm deaths brought the total deaths to 42, a 30% loss rate. This was higher than Davies preferred, but still within acceptable bounds for a trip that met severe weather. The Royal Africa Company would figure profits based on the 98 survivors minus the running costs of the trip, and decide whether Captain Davies deserved a bonus or trouble. For Kunta and the other survivors, the storm's end brought no relief. The lower number of captives meant even less reason for the crew to keep basic cleanliness in the holds. The bodies had been removed, but the dirt remained. Disease continued to spread, now complicated by infections from the injuries people had gotten during the violent motion. The ship's doctor gave no treatment. His job was to watch whether slaves would survive long enough to be sold, not to actually heal them. During the 9th week at sea, something shifted in Kunta's mind. The mental weight of ongoing trauma, isolation, and helplessness had been slowly eating away his sense of self. He had watched men lose their minds, seen death become so common that bodies being removed no longer triggered emotional responses, and felt his own identity begin to break under the constant attack on his humanity. But there was one thing his captors had not been able to take: his name. In Manding, Africa culture, names carried power. They connected you to your ancestors, defined your place in the community, and stood for your essential self. Kinte meant whole or complete, and his father had chosen it specifically to show that this child would grow to fulfill his destiny. As long as Kunta remembered his name, remembered the words his father had spoken during his naming ceremony, remembered the line that stretched back 7 generations, some core part of him remained beyond British control. Other captives near him had begun to lose their names. Under the ongoing trauma of the Middle Passage, memories became unreliable. Men who had boarded the ship, knowing exactly who they were, found themselves struggling to remember basic details about their previous lives. Languages blurred together. Cultural practices that had seemed forever in Africa began to feel like half-remembered dreams. The British did not need to actively wipe out these identities. The conditions they created did that work automatically. Kunta began a private ritual that would keep him going through the remaining weeks of the trip. Each morning during the short exercise period on deck, he would silently say his full line. "I am Kunta Kinte, son of Omoro Kinte, grandson of Kairoba Kunta Kinte, the holy man of the Kinte clan of Jufure." He would list his father's teachings, remember specific lessons about blacksmithing and drum making, recall the taste of foods from his village. These memories became his resistance, proof that he existed as a complete person despite British attempts to reduce him to merchandise. The Lord Ligonier saw the North American coast during the 11th week. The sight of land caused clear changes in the crew's behavior. They cleaned the ship more thoroughly, made repairs to broken equipment, and even improved the captives' food slightly. These preparations had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with market value. Potential buyers in Annapolis would check the cargo carefully, and slaves who appeared too weak or sick would sell for lower prices. On September 29, 1767, the ship entered Annapolis harbor. For the captives, this moment brought an impossible mix of feelings. The trip that had killed 42 of their friends was finally ending, but what awaited them on land was decades of slavery with no clear path to freedom. In a country whose language they did not speak and whose customs were completely strange, the British followed a careful procedure for processing slave ships. First, the harbor master's officials would board to verify the cargo against the ship's list and collect customs taxes. Then, the captives would be brought on deck in small groups, still shackled, for early inspection by potential buyers. Only after this pre-sale viewing would the actual auction take place, usually within a week of arrival, to minimize the costs of feeding and housing the cargo. When Kunta first saw Annapolis, the difference with Africa overwhelmed his senses. The buildings were entirely different. Wooden buildings with pointed roofs instead of round mud structures with thatched covering. The climate felt strange, cooler and drier than the tropical wetness he had known his entire life. And the people were almost entirely white, with only a handful of Africans visible working along the docks. The Maryland Gazette printed an ad on October 1st, 1767. Just imported in the ship Lord Ligonier, Captain Davies from the River Gambia, a cargo of choice, healthy slaves, for sale at Annapolis on Tuesday, the 7th of October. That phrase, choice, healthy slaves, stood for the end of a business process that had turned human beings into farm equipment. The 42 dead were not mentioned in the ad. The trauma experienced by the survivors was not important. What mattered to the Maryland tobacco planters was that 98 Africans were now available for purchase, ready to labor in conditions that would likely kill them within 10 years. The auction itself happened at a tavern near the Annapolis docks. Potential buyers arrived to inspect the merchandise, checking teeth, checking for signs of disease, judging physical strength. Some asked the ship's doctor about the captives' origins, believing that certain African peoples made better workers than others. The doctor described Kunta's group as Mandinka, generally considered suitable for farm labor and less prone to attempted escape than some other groups. This guess was terribly wrong. But white colonists' understanding of African societies was so shallow that they treated all captured peoples as essentially the same. John Waller arrived at the auction representing his family's tobacco plantation in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. The Wallers were a famous family. John's grandfather had been a wealthy landowner, and the family kept multiple properties worked by dozens of enslaved people. John needed several young male slaves to replace workers who had recently died from disease or work-related injuries, and he had brought enough money to buy 3 or 4 captives. When John checked Kunta, he saw exactly what he needed. A teenage male with visible physical strength, no obvious diseases, and the kind of solid build that suggested ability for ongoing physical labor. The fact that Kunta met his eyes directly, a sign of defiance that more experienced slaveholders would have recognized, John saw as proof of intelligence rather than resistance. The bidding was short. Other planters were interested, but John offered a good price quickly and secured the purchase. The deal was recorded in standard business terms. One Negro male, approximately 17 years old, paid in full, transferred to John Waller of Spotsylvania County. Kunta had been property of the British Crown while aboard ship. Now he was private property with John Waller holding the same legal rights over him as over any other farm equipment. The trip from Annapolis to Spotsylvania County took 3 days by wagon. John moved his new purchases in the cargo bed, still shackled, with very little food and water. This was not on purpose cruelty. It was standard practice based on the wide belief that slaves needed to understand their lower status from the first moment. The 3-day trip provided John with chances to say basic commands in English, teaching the captives words like work, stop, food, and sleep. Kunta understood nothing. The English language bore no relationship to Mandinka or any other African language he had met. The sounds seemed harsh and sharp, lacking the musical qualities that made Mandinka words carry multiple meanings depending on how they were said. Without any shared language base, communication happened entirely through gesture and repeating with violence as the main teaching tool for obedience. The Waller plantation took up several hundred acres along the Rappahannock River. Tobacco was the main crop, added to by corn and vegetables grown for local use. The labor force was made up of about 30 enslaved people, mostly African, born with a few second-generation slaves who had been born on the plantation. A white overseer named Connolly managed daily operations under John Waller's general watch, and Connolly's way of managing relied heavily on fear and chosen violence to keep control. When Kunta arrived at the plantation, the enslaved community watched with the careful look of people who understood that new arrivals changed the social mix. Would these Africans be helpful or defiant? Did they speak any common language with the existing workers? Were they skilled in any crafts that might earn them lighter work duties, or would they become field hands, subject to the most brutal labor? John Waller's first order of business was renaming his new property. In his book, he wrote, "Negro male purchased Annapolis, October 1767, given the name Toby. This renaming was not random. It was a planned step in the process of turning a person into a slave." African names were too difficult for white people to say, supposedly, and more importantly, they stood for cultural identity that needed to be wiped out. A slave named Toby had no connection to Africa, no history beyond what his owner allowed, no identity except as property. When Connolly introduced Kunta to the other slaves using this new name, pointing at him and saying Toby repeatedly, Kunta's answer was immediate and natural. He pointed to himself and said clearly, "Kunta Kinte." Connolly saw this as failure to understand rather than refusal to obey, and repeated the name more slowly and loudly. "Toby, Kunta Kinte," Kunta said again with the same clear firmness. In that moment, the basic conflict that would define the next 5 decades of his life became clear. John Waller owned Kunta's body, controlled his labor, could sell him or beat him or work him to death. But Kunta's name, the core of his self, remained his own. Connolly's solution to this communication problem was violence. He hit Kunta across the face, then repeated the name Toby while pointing at him. Kunta responded by saying his real name again. Connolly hit him harder. Kunta, drawing on his warrior training and his father's teachings about dignity under pressure, maintained eye contact and repeated Kunta. What Connolly and John Waller failed to understand was that they were seeing cultural values that had kept the Mandinka people going for centuries. Kunta had been taught that names carried power, that identity went beyond physical circumstances, and that a man who accepted a false name lost something more important than life itself. From Kunta's view, being beaten for saying his name was painful but acceptable. Accepting a false name would mean spiritual death. This fight continued for 3 days. Each time someone called him Toby, Kunta would correct them with his real name. Each correction earned physical punishment, beatings, less food, being alone. The other enslaved people on the plantation watched this conflict with mixed feelings. Some admired Kunta's bravery, others saw it as foolish fighting back that would bring harder treatment for everyone. An older enslaved man named Fiddler, who had been born in Africa but had lived in Virginia for 40 years, approached Kunta during a work break. Speaking in broken Mandinka mixed with English, Fiddler tried to explain the reality of their situation. The white men owned everything, including the ability to pick names. Fighting on this point was useless and would only bring suffering. Better to accept the name Toby publicly while keeping your true self privately. But Kunta could not accept this deal. His father had taught him that partial surrender to injustice inevitably led to complete surrender. If he accepted a false name, even in public, he would be admitting the white men's power to define his identity. That admission would be the first step toward becoming the property they claimed him to be rather than a person who was being held in unjust captivity. On the 4th day, John Waller brought Kunta to the plantation's main house for what he called a lesson in obeying. The process was careful and on purpose public. Waller had Kunta tied to a post in full view of the other slaves, then explained through Connolly's translation what was about to happen. Kunta would be whipped until he accepted his new name. This was not punishment for specific bad behavior. It was a teaching show about the nature of total power. The whipping began with careful skill. Connolly used a leather strap designed to cause Max pain without causing injuries bad enough to lower Kunta's value as a worker. After each strike, Waller asked the same question, "What is your name?" When Kunta answered, "Kunta Kinte," another blow fell. This torture continued until Kunta lost consciousness. When he woke up hours later, chained in the quarters where enslaved people lived, he found himself surrounded by other Africans who had been watching the entire show. Their faces showed a mix of pity, fear, and giving up. They had all been through similar lessons when they first arrived. They had all learned that fighting back led to suffering with no chance of winning, but they had also noticed something that John Waller and Connolly had missed. Despite the beating, Kunta had never once said the name Toby. He had lost consciousness from pain before giving up his identity, and that fact rang true with people who had been forced to compromise themselves in countless ways just to survive. The next morning, still hurt from the whipping, Kunta was put to tobacco field work under Connolly's direct watch. Tobacco farming in 1767, Virginia, was brutally hard work. The process required planting seedlings by hand, constant weeding, removing tobacco worms, topping the plants at the correct growth stage, harvesting leaves as they ripened, and hanging them in curing barns. Each step was time-sensitive and required knowledge that Kunta did not have. Connolly's teaching method consisted of showing an action once, then beating anyone who failed to copy it correctly. By this logic, a slave who did not understand English should learn quickly through pain connection. The reality was that Kunta spent his first weeks in constant confusion, never quite certain what was expected, always one step behind the other workers, who had had years to learn the routines. But Kunta had something that his captors did not recognize. The watching skills his father had taught him during blacksmith training. A good blacksmith learned by watching small details, how metal changed color at different temperatures, which hammer blows achieved specific effects, how the sound of hitting metal showed its readiness for shaping. Kunta used those same skills to learn plantation operations, watching not just what people did, but the exact order and timing of their actions. Within 2 weeks, Kunta had mastered basic tobacco fieldwork well enough to avoid most beatings. He still did not understand English commands, but he had learned to read the situation, watching what other workers did, and copying their actions, guessing what Connolly would demand based on the time of day and stage of tobacco growth, keeping his head down and his movement steady to avoid drawing attention. The other enslaved people began to recognize that this African newcomer was different. Most recently arrived captives lived in a state of mental shock for months, moving through their work like robots, barely aware of their surroundings. Kunta was clearly hurt. His eyes showed the same 1,000-yard stare that everyone developed after experiencing Middle Passage horror. But he remained alert and engaged in a way that suggested his mind had not been broken. This mental strength came from the same source as his refusal to accept a false name, his father's teachings about keeping dignity under oppression. Amoro had lived his entire life 2 miles from a British slave fort. He had raised his children with a clear understanding that their freedom was fragile and could be stolen at any moment. But he had also taught them that inner identity, the knowledge of who you really were, could never be taken unless you gave it up willingly. The weeks turned into months and a routine emerged. Kunta worked in the tobacco fields from dawn to dusk, ate the very small rations provided to enslaved workers, slept in the crowded quarters, and endured the casual violence that marked plantation life. John Waller occasionally tested whether the whipping had been effective, calling Kunta Toby and watching for his response. Each time Kunta would either remain silent or quietly correct with his real name, earning a slap across the head, but never the severe beating that might lower his ability to work. Waller found this behavior strange, but not particularly worrying. Some slaves took longer to break than others. As long as Kunta did his work adequately and didn't actively rebel, his refusal to accept his slave name was an annoyance rather than a serious problem. Waller assumed that time and ongoing exposure to plantation reality would eventually wear down any resistance. What Waller didn't recognize was that every day Kunta maintained his name, he won a small victory against the system designed to destroy him. And other enslaved people on the plantation noticed those victories. They saw an African who had survived the Middle Passage horror, endured whippings for refusing to give up his identity, and somehow kept his essential self despite everything slavery threw at him. As winter approached in 1767, Kunta had been enslaved for 6 months, captured in July, moved across the Atlantic, sold in October, and worked through the tobacco harvest season. In Mandinka culture, he should have been celebrating his 18th birthday, taking on adult duties in his village, perhaps being considered for marriage. Instead, he was property in a foreign country, doing farm work he had never trained for, unable to speak in the local language, and surrounded by people who had been so thoroughly broken by slavery that most had forgotten resistance was even possible. But Kunta hadn't forgotten, and that fact would make what happened next both unavoidable and scary. The story of Toby, the slave who refused his name, was about to take a turn that would shock even the hard overseers of Spotsylvania County. But first, we need you to do something. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens when a man chooses freedom over survival. Winter's arrival brought new horrors no one guessed. Virginia winters in the late 1760s were harsh by the standards of someone raised in tropical West Africa. Temperatures dropped below freezing regularly, and the enslaved workers' quarters provided very little protection from the cold. The Waller plantation, like most Virginia tobacco operations, didn't invest in adequate winter housing for slaves. The logic being that warm buildings cost money, while slaves who died from cold exposure could be replaced through buying. Kunta's first Virginia winter introduced him to body suffering distinct from the tropical diseases he had known in Africa. Frostbite damaged his fingers during morning work, when the ground was frozen solid. Lung infections spread through the quarters with deadly speed. Close quarters, poor airflow, and poor clothing created perfect conditions for spreading sickness. Several slaves died during that first winter, their bodies buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the plantation property. During this season, Kunta made his first escape attempt. The idea had been forming since his arrival. Every day at the plantation reinforced his understanding that this situation was temporary, not because anyone would free him, but because death from overwork, disease, or punishment would eventually end his suffering. The only question was whether he would die as property or die while attempting to reclaim freedom. Kunta's knowledge of North American geography was basically zero. He understood that he had been moved across a large body of water, which meant Africa lay in some direction across the ocean. He had seen that the sun rose and set in patterns similar to Africa, suggesting similar latitude. But beyond these basic observations, he had no map, no knowledge of distances, no understanding of the land he would need to cross. His plan was extremely simple: escape during the night, travel away from the plantation in whatever direction seemed least crowded, and either find a way back to the coast or find other Africans who might have made free communities. This plan had almost no chance of success, but Kunta understood that success wasn't the only measure of meaningful action. Sometimes resistance had value, even when it was useless. The escape happened in January 1768, during a week when Connolly was away visiting family in Fredericksburg. The remaining white boss was less watchful about evening head counts, and Kunta had noticed a pattern. If all slaves appeared to be present during the first evening check, no one checked later in the night. The winter cold meant everyone stayed inside the quarters as much as possible, so unusual movements were less likely to be noticed. Kunta waited until about midnight, then quietly left the quarters through a back door whose lock had been broken for weeks. He moved carefully, knowing that dogs might be loose on the property and that several white families lived within half a mile of the Waller plantation. His clothing consisted of the minimal rags provided to field workers, completely poor for winter weather, but the only option available. For the first 3 miles, everything went according to Kunta's limited plan. He followed a creek bed heading roughly north, reasoning that waterways might eventually lead to larger rivers and ultimately the ocean. The physical challenge was immediate. His feet, poorly protected by rough shoes made from scraps, began to suffer from the cold within an hour. The winter land was totally strange, nothing like the African forest he had known. Near dawn, Kunta heard dogs barking in the distance behind him. The sound triggered an immediate understanding. The plantation had discovered he was gone, and professional slave catchers were already chasing him. These were not random farm dogs. They were tracking hounds trained specifically to hunt escaped slaves capable of following a scent trail for miles. What happened next showed the cruel efficiency of the 18th century Virginia slave-catching system. Connolly had returned earlier than expected and noticed Kunta's absence during the morning work call. He immediately contacted Thomas Matthews, a professional slave catcher who worked throughout Spotsylvania County. Matthews kept a team of trained dogs and several helpers who specialized in tracking and catching escaped slaves. Matthews' approach to slave catching was careful. He started at the point of escape, let his dogs pick up the scent, and then followed at a steady pace that allowed the dogs to do most of the work. His payment structure was simple. He received a flat fee for successful catch, plus costs. If the escaped slave fought back violently, Matthews was allowed to use whatever force necessary to ensure obeying, provided the slave survived in condition to continue working. Kunta had covered perhaps 8 miles when the dogs caught up to him. The meeting happened in a clearing where the land offered no defensive advantages. Matthews' helpers surrounded him while the dogs created a wall that made escape impossible. Through hand signs and broken English, Matthews showed that Kunta should return willingly. When Kunta didn't immediately obey, not from fighting back, but from not understanding, Matthews ordered his helpers to hold him forcibly. They tied Kunta's hands and attached a rope around his neck, then began the 8-mile walk back to the Waller plantation. Matthews followed his standard practice of parading captured slaves along main roads during daylight hours. This public show served multiple purposes. It reminded enslaved people throughout the county that escape was useless. It advertised Matthews' services to plantation owners, and it strengthened white communities' sense of control over the black population. When they arrived at the Waller plantation, Connolly and John Waller were waiting. The next hours would be recorded in detail in the memories of every enslaved person who saw what happened, not because it was unusual for slave catchers to punish captured runaways, but because of what Kunta's response showed about the limits of human strength. John Waller had Kunta tied to the same post where he had been whipped for refusing his slave name, but this punishment served a different purpose. The name whipping had been about setting up power. This beating was about terror, creating an example so brutal that no other slave would consider escape. Connolly did the whipping with skill, striking Kunta's back in patterns designed to maximize pain without causing life-threatening injuries. Between each set of strikes, Waller asked changes of the same question, "Will you run again?" The expected response was immediate denial and begging for mercy. The reality was that Kunta, drawing on reserves of strength that defied rational explanation, remained mostly silent throughout the beating. This silence disturbed Waller more than screaming would have. A slave who screamed and begged showed he understood his helplessness and could be broken. A slave who endured torture silently possessed some inner resistance that whipping couldn't reach. After 30 strikes, enough to leave Kunta's back a mass of bleeding wounds, Waller stopped the beating and ordered Kunta to be locked in a storage shed for a week with very little food and water. The week in isolation gave Kunta time to think about the results of his escape attempt. The physical pain was severe but manageable. He had experienced similar injuries during warrior training in Africa, and the human body's capacity to handle pain was greater than most people realized. What worried him more was the failure of his escape. 8 miles in 12 hours was tragically poor. The tracking dogs had found him easily, and he had learned nothing about the land between the plantation and potential freedom. But the escape had also revealed something important about the plantation system. It relied on terror and watching rather than physical walls. There were no walls around the Waller property, no guards posted at the edges. The prison was mental. The slave's knowledge that escape meant being hunted by dogs and returned for brutal punishment. Kunta began to consider whether future escape attempts needed different planning. Rather than fleeing immediately without preparation, perhaps he needed to learn English, gather information about the land, find potential friends, and wait for the right moment. This thinking required patience that his warrior training hadn't developed. But it also admitted the reality that sudden escape attempts accomplished nothing except showing defiance. When Kunta returned to fieldwork after his week of being locked up, the other enslaved people treated him with a mix of respect and concern. No one discussed the escape attempt directly. Talking about resistance near white people was dangerously foolish. But Kunta noticed subtle changes in how people acted with him. Fiddler began teaching him English more actively, providing words that might prove useful for survival. Other workers shared small amounts of their food rations, recognizing that Kunta was being fed less as continued punishment. These small acts of togetherness created bonds that John Waller and Connolly never recognized. From the white perspective, the plantation's enslaved population consisted of separate individuals competing for slightly better treatment. The reality was that trauma and oppression created powerful connections among people who understood that survival required help. As spring arrived in 1768, Kunta had been enslaved for 10 months. His English had improved enough to understand basic commands and say simple ideas. He had learned the tobacco growing cycle well enough to avoid most beatings, and he had begun to recognize that the Waller plantation existed within a larger system of slavery that went throughout Virginia and beyond. This understanding came mainly from conversations with Fiddler, who had lived in Virginia long enough to develop a full picture of colonial slavery's size. There were hundreds of plantations in Spotsylvania County alone. Thousands more spread throughout Virginia. The entire local economy depended on enslaved labor, tobacco, corn, wheat, livestock. White Virginians had created a society where enslaved Africans outnumbered white colonists in many counties. Yet, they kept control through planned terror and the legal right to give unlimited violence on black bodies. Fiddler also explained something that Kunta found at first impossible to understand. There were enslaved people who had never seen Africa, who had been born on Virginia plantations to parents who were themselves born into slavery. These second and third generation slaves grew up speaking English, practicing Christianity, and having no direct memory of African culture. From the white perspective, these people were ideal slaves. They had no other cultural framework and could be more easily controlled than African-born captives. This information forced Kunta to face a disturbing possibility. Slavery wasn't a temporary condition that would end when enough Africans rebelled or when white colonists recognized the injustice. It was a permanent system designed to reproduce itself across generations. The children of enslaved people became property of their parents' owners. Freedom had no obvious path. In May 1768, Kunta made his second escape attempt. This effort showed slightly more planning than the first. He had stolen food scraps over several weeks, hidden them in the quarters, and found a route that followed established roads rather than random wild paths. His English was now good enough for basic trickery. If questioned by white travelers, he could claim to be on an errand for his master, buying himself hours before anyone became suspicious. The escape lasted 3 days before Matthew's dogs found him hiding in a barn roughly 20 miles from the Waller plantation. The recapture followed the same pattern as before. Matthews and his helpers surrounded him, tied him, and paraded him back along public roads as a warning to other potential runaways. John Waller's response was more severe this time. Kunta had shown that standard punishment wasn't stopping his escape attempts. Waller needed to step up to a level of consequence that would make further resistance mentally impossible. The method Waller chose, cutting off half of Kunta's right foot, was standard practice in colonial Virginia for dealing with stubborn escape attempts. The logic was coldly practical. A slave who couldn't run away effectively kept most of his farming work value while losing his movement. Plantation owners throughout the South used this particular injury frequently enough that there were set procedures for minimizing infection risk and healing time. Dr. William Waller, John's brother and a trained doctor, did the cutting operation. The procedure happened in the plantation's tool shed with Kunta tied down and several white men holding him still. No painkiller was provided. The cost wasn't justified for slave punishment, and the pain was considered part of the warning effect. What the historical records don't adequately show is the mental impact of this cutting. From John Waller's perspective, he was changing property to prevent future loss, no different than marking cattle or clipping a horse's legs to prevent running away. From Kunta's perspective, he was experiencing state-allowed torture inflicted by someone who believed he had the moral and legal right to permanently hurt another human being. The cutting achieved its intended physical effect. Kunta would never again be able to run effectively, which meant future escape attempts would face problems too big to overcome. But it had an unplanned result. It turned Kunta from a nameless field slave into someone whose story other enslaved people remembered and repeated. Stories about the African who had tried to escape twice despite knowing the consequences, who had endured cutting rather than submit completely to slavery, who kept his real name despite years of punishment. These stories spread through the secret communication networks that connected enslaved communities throughout Virginia. Kunta became a symbol of resistance, not because his resistance was successful, but because it continued despite absolutely crushing odds. During his recovery from the cutting, confined to the quarters and unable to work, Kunta had long conversations with Fiddler and other longtime slaves. These discussions showed aspects of plantation life he hadn't previously understood. The other enslaved people had made smart strategies for keeping dignity and humanity despite their circumstances. They kept secret family connections across different plantations. They practiced African religious traditions in hidden meetings. They taught their children about freedom even when freedom seemed impossible. These conversations also showed the complexity of survival under slavery. Some people had chosen cooperation with plantation authorities, serving as foremen or house servants, trading minor privileges for enforcing rules among field workers. Others had embraced Christianity, finding in the religion a way for understanding suffering and keeping hope for eventual justice. Still, others had developed mental tools that allowed them to function despite trauma, keeping separate parts of their sense of self, acting obedient while maintaining private resistance. Kunta listened to these stories and recognized that his total approach, refusing his slave name, attempting escape despite impossible odds, represented only one strategy among many. Other people's choices weren't cowardice or helping the enemy. They were different answers to the same impossible question. How do you maintain humanity when a system is designed to destroy it? When Kunta returned to work after his injury healed, his assigned tasks changed. With limited movement from the cutting, he couldn't keep up with fieldwork that required constant movement. Instead, Dr. William Waller, who had purchased Kunta from his brother after the cutting, assigned him to garden maintenance and eventually to driving the buggy that moved the Waller family around the county. This role change brought Kunta into closer contact with the Waller household and provided insights into white colonial society he hadn't had as a field worker. He watched the Wallers' daily routines, their social relationships with other plantation families, their religious practices, and their casual discussions about slavery, as if it were no more morally complicated than livestock management. These observations forced Kunta to face a disturbing truth. The white people who enslaved him weren't monsters in the simple sense. They were ordinary people who had been raised in a society that made absolute power over black bodies normal. They attended church, celebrated holidays, expressed love for their families, and truly believed they were moral beings while simultaneously owning human beings and treating them as farm equipment. This realization didn't create sympathy. Kunta understood that accepted evil was still evil, but it clarified the size of what he was fighting against. Slavery wasn't kept by a few cruel individuals who could be removed or convinced. It was woven into the entire social structure of colonial Virginia, supported by law, religion, economics, and cultural ideas that most white people never questioned. As the years passed, 1769, 1770, 1771, Kunta's role on the Waller plantation became increasingly complex. He learned English well, which allowed him to understand the full size of what slavery meant in Virginia. He watched the plantation's operations closely, recognizing the money math that determined every aspect of enslaved life. And he began to recognize that his resistance had taken a different form than he had originally imagined. He couldn't escape. The cutting had made that physically impossible, and he couldn't fight. One man against an entire system backed by legal authority and unlimited violence had no chance. But he could maintain his identity, preserve his cultural knowledge, and pass that legacy to others. His name remained Kunta Kinte regardless of what the Wallers called him. His identity as a Mandinka warrior remained intact despite his enslaved status. During this period, Kunta developed a relationship with an enslaved woman named Belle, who worked as the Waller household's cook. Belle had been born in Virginia to African parents, and her life experience spanned the gap between African cultural memory and American slavery. She spoke English as her main language, but remembered African words her parents had taught her. She practiced a mixed religion that combined Christianity with African spiritual traditions, and she had developed survival strategies that balanced cooperation with the Wallers against maintaining private resistance. Their relationship grew slowly over months of conversation in the plantation kitchen where Kunta would wait while Dr. Waller conducted business inside the house. Belle recognized in Kunta something she had rarely seen: an African-born person who had kept his essential identity despite years of brutal attempts to break him. Kunta recognized in Belle someone who had found ways to preserve humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. In 1772, Belle became pregnant with Kunta's child. This pregnancy meant a moment of deep importance for Kunta. In Mandinka culture, having children meant continuing your family line, passing on cultural knowledge, and ensuring that your identity would survive beyond your death. Under slavery, having children meant bringing a new person into chains, watching your daughter or son become property, and knowing they would suffer the same trauma you had experienced. Belle's daughter, whom Kunta insisted on naming Kizzy, a Mandinka word meaning you stay put, was born in 1773. Kunta approached fatherhood with the same determination he had brought to keeping his name. He would teach Kizzy African words, tell her stories about her grandfather, Amoro Kinte, and ensure she knew that her real heritage went beyond the plantation where she was born as property. This teaching happened in secret during moments when no white people were present to watch. Kunta would hold his infant daughter and speak to her in Mandinka, describing the village of Jufyo that she would never see. He would tell his family line, ensuring that even if Kizzy grew up enslaved, she would know that her ancestors had been free people with culture, history, and dignity. Belle watched these interactions with mixed feelings. She understood Kunta's desire to pass on his heritage, but she also recognized the danger. If the Wallers discovered that Kunta was teaching Kizzy African culture, they might sell the child to another plantation as punishment. Belle had already lost 2 infant children to such sales, and the pain of those losses never fully healed. The tension between preserving cultural identity and protecting children from the worst consequences of slavery would define Kizzy's childhood. Kunta wanted her to remember Africa and maintain resistance. Belle wanted her to learn English perfectly, practice Christianity publicly, and develop skills that might earn her slightly better treatment within the plantation system. Both approaches came from love and from traumatic experience with slavery's brutal realities. As Kizzy grew from baby to child, Kunta taught her a list of African words: cow, river, harvest, guitar. These words had no practical use in Virginia, but they stood for connections to a world beyond slavery. When Kizzy pointed to a river and said Kambibalongo, the Mandinka name for the Gambia River, she was speaking a language her enslavers couldn't understand and maintaining a cultural tradition they couldn't erase. In 1780, when Kizzy was 7 years old, something happened that would test everything Kunta had tried to teach her about identity and resistance. Missy Ann, the niece of Dr. William Waller, began visiting the plantation often and developed a friendship with Kizzy. Missy Ann was roughly the same age as Kizzy, and in the innocent way that children sometimes can, she saw Kizzy as a playmate rather than property. This friendship created a complicated situation. Miss Ann began teaching Kizzy to read and write, skills that were illegal for enslaved people to have in Virginia. The law stopped slave reading specifically because educated slaves posed a greater escape risk and might fake traveling papers. But Miss Ann, operating from a child's limited understanding of slavery's meanings, simply wanted to share her knowledge with her friend. Kunta and Belle faced an impossible decision. If they told Kizzy not to learn to read, they would protect her from potential consequences if her reading was discovered, but they would also prevent her from gaining knowledge that might someday prove useful. If they allowed the lessons to continue secretly, they risked terrible punishment if the Wallers learned about it. They chose to let Kizzy learn with strong warnings to never reveal her reading to any white person except Miss Ann. This decision would have devastating consequences. By 1785, Kizzy had reached her teenage years. She had grown into a young woman who showed all the contradictions of her position. American, born but raised with African cultural knowledge, enslaved but able to read, aware of the plantation system's cruelty, but never having experienced the Middle Passage horror her father endured. Her relationship with Miss Ann had continued, creating bonds of real affection that somehow existed alongside the basic inequality of their positions. During this time, a young enslaved man named Noah arrived at a neighboring plantation. Noah had been born in Virginia and was close to Kizzy's age. The two developed a relationship during church gatherings where enslaved people from multiple plantations were allowed to attend services together. This relationship, conducted under constant watch and with no privacy, represented the full complexity of love under slavery, genuine human connection existing within a system designed to prevent it. In 1786, Noah decided to escape. His plan was to reach Pennsylvania, which had begun slow freedom, and then somehow return to help Kizzy escape as well. This plan had virtually no chance of success, but Noah was young enough to believe that love could overcome systemic oppression. He asked Kizzy to write him a traveling pass. a document claiming he had permission from his master to travel for specific business purposes. Such passes were routine for enslaved people who had errands requiring travel between properties. Kizzy's secret reading made her one of the few enslaved people capable of creating a convincing fake. Kizzy understood the huge danger. Writing a fake traveling pass wasn't just forbidden. It was a serious crime that would result in brutal punishment and likely sale to another plantation. But Noah argued that without the pass, his escape attempt had no chance, while with it, he might actually reach freedom. And Kizzy, at 16 years old and in love, made the choice to help him despite knowing the potential consequences. Noah's escape attempt failed within 2 days. Slave catchers found the fake pass in his possession and traced the handwriting to Kizzy. When Dr. William Waller learned that his enslaved cook's daughter could read and write and had used that reading to help an escape attempt, his response was immediate and unforgiving. Kizzy was sold to a trader who specialized in moving slaves to plantations in North Carolina. The sale happened within 24 hours of the discovery, specifically to prevent Belle and Kunta from attempting any action. One day, Kizzy was living with her parents on the Waller plantation. The next day, she was property of a stranger, being moved several hundred miles away with no possibility of contact with her family. For Kunta and Belle, this loss represented the coming true of every nightmare slavery had threatened. They had raised a daughter, taught her about dignity and identity, and watched her grow into a young woman capable of remarkable courage. And then the system they had been fighting against for decades showed its ultimate power. It could take their child, and they were legally powerless to stop it. Kunta's response to this loss would define the final decades of his life. He had endured capture in Africa, survived the Middle Passage, withstood repeated beatings, maintained his identity despite constant pressure, and even accepted the cutting of his foot, rather than completely submit to slavery. But losing Kizzy to a forced sale broke something in him that previous trauma hadn't touched. The historical records show that after Kizzy's sale, Kunta became increasingly quiet. He continued his work as doctor. Waller's buggy driver maintained his dignity and never forgot his name. But friends among the enslaved community noticed changes, longer periods of silence, less engagement with the small resistances that had marked his earlier years, a kind of quiet acceptance that the system he had been fighting would ultimately win. This mental shift wasn't surrender in the simple sense. Kunta never accepted that slavery was justified or that he deserved his status. But he had learned through unbearable experience that maintaining identity and resisting oppression didn't prevent the system from inflicting the worst possible suffering, losing your children to a business deal. The years continued with grim sureness. Kunta worked, aged, and watched as the plantation system improved itself. Virginia's tobacco economy grew. More Africans arrived through the slave trade. Second and third generation enslaved people grew up knowing no other life. And the white colonial society that depended on this system developed increasingly elaborate excuses for why enslaved people deserved their status. In 1810, Belle died from problems of pneumonia, one of many diseases that spread through enslaved quarters due to poor housing and medical care. Kunta continued working for another 12 years until age and gathered injuries made even light labor impossible. In 1822, at approximately 70 years old, Kunta Kinte died on the Waller plantation, still enslaved, never having returned to Africa or gained his freedom. The plantation records show his death recorded as Toby, age approximately 70,